A warm and friendly hello. Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we'll be joined in a few minutes by one of our good friends, Evan Miyakawa. He does great work over at evanmiya.com, one of the best statisticians that you're going to find covering this great game of college basketball. We are going to be just putting a little bit of a bow around this past season, how historic it was that we saw four teams as strong as they were be able to make the Final Four, just how his metrics took a look at last season in comparison to past years. If that's going to be a little bit of a sign of something to come as well, and we're also going to be talking about what we can expect this offseason if we're going to see, as I guess you'd call it, as chalky of a season during the 2025-26 season as we saw this past year as well, and just how he's taking a look at this great game of college basketball, and also how he tries to decipher which teams are going to be able to do a good job with the transfers that they're bringing in, which guys are going to be good fits, which guys are going to be not so good fits as well, and just how his model is trying to be able to project forward as well. So we're going to be talking about that with Evan in a few minutes, and then in the final segment, I'm going to get you guys a recap of the news and notes that we saw in college basketball on Tuesday. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at Junit_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline, and the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review, and I always like to clear segment number 1 for all those questions. If I don't receive any of those questions, comments, what have you, we'll just stick with 2-part conversations, which I've been doing mostly for the last few weeks just because there's no games to recap or anything like that, and let's call it what it is. We've got north of a 150-day off season here upcoming, so we've got ourselves a long time before games are going to be back in our lives. By the way, hopefully within the next, I'm going to call it about month and a half, we start up those conference previews as well, which I always do on this podcast. I cannot wait for that, so that's going to be on the docket for myself, but also on the docket for myself is making sure that you all know about Edge Boost, because Edge Boost, they do power everything on this podcast, and they make sure that bettors are able to access their funds 24/7, 365, and on leap years, that becomes 366 days, because unlike some places that run on credit, things like this is just an account that allows you to access your funds all throughout the year, no matter when you need them. All of your gambling transactions, they're going to be approved, and if you go to edgeboost.bet, utilize the promo code of Greg, that is GREG, your first $25 deposit, that's going to be matched dollar for dollar. That is GREG over at edgeboost.bet. Now let's chat with Evan Miyakawa. He does such great work over at evanmiya.com. He has been doing great work with his kill shot data over the last few seasons. Just does a great job on so many different fronts. When it comes to gauging this great game of college basketball, you're able to follow him on Twitter/X at Evan Miya. That is his first name, EVAN, and then MAIA. And Evan, great to get you aboard. Thank you.
Glad to be here, Greg.
Glad to have you aboard. And Evan, you are one of the best minds out there in college basketball, so I truly do appreciate you and want to get your thoughts on, first things first, before we take a look at what we've got in this offseason, just a little bit of a capper on what we saw this past year, because in my opinion, we saw 4 teams that in just about any other year, they would have probably been the favorite to be able to win the title. We saw all 4 of them be able to make the Final Four, and was what we saw this last year from those 4 teams that made the Final Four a sign of things to come, in your opinion? Or do you think that this was just a one-off where we had 4 very dominant teams that just also happened to land on the same year?
I'm not overreacting to that too much, if I'm being honest. I certainly think that there is a chance that going forward, we're going to see more top-heavy teams, more 1 and 2 seeds, comprising that Final Four, and it being slightly more chalky, just because it's harder and harder for mid-major teams to consistently be really good, kind of above the rest of the country outside of those high majors. But I do think that overreacting to this Final Four and saying that this is just going to be how it is going forward, that we're going to see, all these 1 seeds in the tournament and we're not going to have as many upsets. I think that's, we're just looking at a 1-year sample size. 2 years ago, we had one of the most topsy-turvy Final Fours we've ever seen, with the likes of, Florida Atlantic and San Diego State there. And the thing, too, is that it's not like these 4 teams that we saw in the Final Four were all considered to be the best 4 teams in the country coming into the year. Florida was, barely inside the top 25 in the preseason, according to the AP poll. I think my model had them closer to 30. It became very evident as the season went along that they were one of the most talented teams in the country. But it wasn't like this season went as predicted. There were teams like Kansas and like Alabama who were top 2, top 3 teams in the preseason, who didn't get to the Final Four, and in the case of some of them, weren't even close. I wouldn't read too much into it. I certainly think that, this was definitely an outlier in the sense that this is not going to be the norm going forward. And so I expect things to be a little bit more kind of in the middle, for next season, for example.
Yep, and I think that that's so well said because when we saw the Final Four in 2024, NC State, they were a clear outlier making the Final Four as they were a team that was going from not being in the NCAA tournament to winning the ACC tournament. So I do agree with you. Somewhere between A and B, not getting NC State's into the Final Four and at the same time not getting 4-1 seeds. And I do think that it's going to be really interesting to see how things are allocated here in the offseason as well. Because the one takeaway that I do have from this past season is that schools like the SEC and these schools that are spending money, I think that they are going to be mainstays in college basketball. And I think that it is interesting in the landscape of things that we see now because I do think that with regards to NIL, these schools that they just stick in general resources into college basketball, they are willing to spend the money, they are going to be a little bit more successful. And I do think that moving forward, even though I think that there's going to be better years for mid-majors, I think that somewhere between A and B, and we might see the mid-majors fall from where they were perhaps 5 or so years ago when we did have some of those unexpected Final Four teams.
Yeah, I still think we're going to see mid-majors be successful, but it just may not be the same ones every year because when you have a really good season as a mid-major, it's much harder for you to keep that success sustained over multiple years because your coach is more likely than ever to get poached to a better program. Your best players are more likely to get big offers in the portal. And so you look at teams this year like, UC San Diego, who had a really, really good year. It's just going to be impossible for them a team like that to be the same level of strength next year because they were so good that their roster is all going to leave and go to better opportunities. So I don't necessarily think that means we're not going to have good mid-majors, but maybe the best ones each year might change more often than what we've seen in the past. So I certainly think that's one trend. I think the other thing that really sticks out to me is I've put a lot of time into looking at the data of how teams are constructing their rosters kind of in this modern era where you can realistically get players from a lot of different avenues to comprise your roster. You can get them through the high school ranks and get talented freshmen on your roster, which is what we've seen for years. You can, get players to return to your team who were on the team the previous season. And now more than ever, you can fill up and completely rebuild your roster with players through the portal. And so I think there are more avenues than ever for a coach, especially a new coach, to rebuild and revamp their roster. But when you look at the 4 teams in the Final Four this year, one of them, Duke, was arguably the most talented team in the country, both in terms of NBA talent and just overall talent in college basketball. So it wasn't a surprise that they got to the Final Four and were on arguably this season the most dominant team we saw in the sport, even though they didn't win the title. But those other 3 teams, Florida, Houston, and Auburn, all had a majority of their minutes coming from returning players. I think they were all over 60% of their minutes were played by guys who were on the roster the previous season. I think it is more than important than ever for teams to focus on retaining the key talent on their roster that could return for them. If your roster stinks, like rebuild it, get new talent in, that's not a problem at all. But I think a lot of teams overestimate the value of getting their key contributors from the previous season to come back the next season because they think, well, if this guy leaves, we can just replace him with someone else. And the reality is that it is much harder for a new player to mesh and have chemistry with your roster in the same way that maybe an equally talented player who was on the squad the previous season can do. And so I think a lot of the best teams going forward are going to be these teams that maybe their roster is comprised mostly of players who were in the transfer portal at one point, but have then been with their program for multiple years. You look at guys like Walter Clayton, who transferred from Iona to Florida, but was in his multiple years into his time at Florida. LJ Cryer at Houston, another example. Janai Broom, one of the top 2 players in the country, was a transfer, but he was with the Tigers for multiple seasons. So I think that kind of recruitment is more important than ever.
And I think that that's so well said by you because that's something that I've also noticed. It's not just bringing in guys from the transfer portal as a one-year rental, being able to get them to buy into your program, being able to get them back for season number 2, season number 3, and you don't necessarily need to take a shot on them coming out of high school. That has been so big for these teams. Look at UConn and their back-to-back titles as well. So glad that you agree with me on that front, as Evan Miyakawa, who does great work over at evanmiya.com, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. And Evan, when it comes to your model, how do you take a look at some of these guys that are going to be with a new team and the success / lack thereof success that they might have? Because I know your model does such a great job of being able to dive in past like these surface level numbers, because everyone wants to look at a guy that was averaging like 13 points per game at insert school here and think, oh, well, he was averaging 13 points per game here. He should be able to do that at the next stop. And you know as well as I do, it's not that simple. And what sort of things do you take a look at in terms of whether a guy is going to be a fit or not, which I fully recognize before asking this question in general, it is very hard for anyone to be able to decipher.
Yeah, I think it's pretty challenging no matter what to be able to project how good a player is going to be when he transfers, just because the change in team context really does matter a lot. And you know, the fit to a specific team matters just as much as the overall talent of that player. And so, you know, obviously it's hard to account for all that stuff, but there are a number of factors that my statistical model takes into account when trying to project how good a player would be for any given team next year when he enters the portal. The main factor is his individual stats, and on a per possession basis, how effective has that player been in terms of traditional things like scoring and rebounding and turnovers and shot efficiency and stuff like that. But it also looks too at, regardless of your individual stats, when you're on the court, are you having an impact positively or negatively on your team's performance in terms of the outcomes that your offense is seeing, that your defense is seeing, adjusting for the level of competition that you're playing and all those sorts of things? Because some of the best, most valuable players in college basketball, the players that maybe score less than 10 points per game, but have a really, really big impact on team performance, kind of as a glue piece for them on offense and defense. And then the third thing that I look at as well is a player's history from previous seasons, not just the past one, matters as well. And a player's recruiting profile of high school, especially if they're a younger player, can often point to an unrealized potential. So today, on Tuesday, April 22nd, we just had Boogie Flan from Arkansas enter the portal. Now, there's a good chance he's going to go to the NBA draft, but if he were to stay in college, he would be the highest rated transfer player in the portal, according to my model, of all the players who have entered. And the reason for that is not necessarily because he was the best player amongst all those last year, but when you look at the production that he had as a freshman, along with the fact that he was a really highly regarded 5-star recruit out of high school, a lot of times these players end up being even better the following season as a transfer because they have an unrealized potential still because they're still so young in college. And so my model takes that into account as well. And so that all gets baked into this final number in offense and defense that you can sum up to say, overall, this is roughly how good this player should be next year.
Yep, and I think that it's just such an interesting way to be able to take a look at things in general with regards to how these guys might be able to perform, what is going to mesh / not mesh with them, the shot quality that you're able to go just so far down the list. And ultimately, sometimes it comes down to what you're going to be able to get in terms of chemistry in the locker room, and that's something that you can't bear out on a stat sheet as well. So I always do find that to be very interesting, and I want to go back to something that you were talking about before. These teams with a little bit of chemistry, these teams that have been able to retain these guys for multiple years, and I fully recognize I'm doing this as we still have a few guys that are going to be declaring for the transfer portal. We still have a little bit of time as I'm recording this with the transfer portal being open, but in terms of what you've seen this offseason, have there been a few teams that have been able to do a better job of maintaining some of the guys from last year than other teams? Because right now, as I record this, there's 2,400 guys in the transfer portal, which you know as well as I do. There's more guys in the transfer portal than guys that did not declare for the transfer portal, but have there been any teams that have stood out to you this far this offseason that you like the fact that they will retain some of their guys from the previous year?
Yeah, I really do think that retention is key because, as I pointed out earlier, a lot of the best teams who have championship aspirations have been the ones who keep the key guys from the previous season and then add a couple key players to the portal or through high school ranks to raise that talent level to the level that you want as a championship level squad. You know, I look at a team like a Purdue this year, for example, who is right now intending on returning Braden Smith, who could be the preseason National Player of the Year, along with Trey Kaufman-Renn, who is one of the best scorers that we're going to have in the country, Fletcher Loyer, who is one of the most lethal three-point shooters in the country. So keeping those core three along with a couple other pieces, and then you go in the portal and you get a guy like Oscar Clough, who Purdue is known as having a track record of great, efficient, productive big men. I think he really fits as another piece on that roster. I know that they also just got, a new player from overseas who could be potentially good for them as well. So I really like what a team like Purdue is doing. I look at a team like BYU, for example, who has only to date brought in one single transfer, but it's Rob Wright, who from Baylor had a really, really productive season as a freshman. He was a really highly regarded recruit coming out of high school. And so when you combine those two things, I predict for him to be one of the best offensive players in the country next year because he's expected to take another leap. You're tagging him in with some returning players, and of course, AJ DeBansa, who's going to be the biggest freshman in the country, arguably next year at BYU. So I think that's really smart. Obviously, there are some teams that maybe it's either out of their control in the sense that there's just no way that they were able to retain a lot of their players who entered the portal or graduated. But there are some other teams, too, who are just dramatically trying to raise the talent level on their roster compared to the players that they had last year. Like a team like in Iowa, for example, they've brought in 7 transfers. On my website, I have transfer class rankings based on looking at both the quality and quantity of players that you're bringing in. Iowa ranked number 4 right now in the country, and part of that's because you're getting Bennett Sturts as a quote-unquote transfer, even though he's following his coach from the previous school. He's one of the best transfers in the country, and then you're building a lot of the roster around him, and I think they've been really smart with the way they've done it. So there's lots of different ways that teams can do this, but ultimately, as we pointed out before, anytime you have the opportunity to return key players from the last season and then add a couple key pieces around them, that's always what I would advocate for.
Yep, I'm right there with you. I think that this is so big in this day and age because everyone wants to be enamored by the guy that scored double figures at the previous spot, but sometimes you don't know what you got until it's gone, and being able to retain these guys, I think is so key. So glad that you agree. There is Evan Miyakawa, who does great work over at evanmia.com, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, and I want to get your thoughts on this as well because you've done a great job with this data over the last few seasons, the kill shot data and just how much that means, and I want you to do 2 things for me. One, lay out just how big it is during the game for a team to be able to get a kill shot, which for those that don't know, that's a run of 10-0 or greater. And 2, what are some of the characteristics of some of these teams that do not allow these runs? Because I know you've done a great job of compiling it over the last few seasons, and it has made a great impact on how we've been viewing these games, especially if you're like a live bettor that is trying to be able to extract value from games that are happening in progress.
So a kill shot is any time that a team scores 10 or more unanswered points in a game. So if you go on a 13-0 run or a 16-0 run, that counts as a kill shot. And I count every single time that a team goes on one of these during a season, as well as every single time that they give one of these up, because these 10-0 runs are a great indicator of teams who have the ability to change the momentum and flip the script in their direction in a game, or conversely, who are maybe more at risk of giving up a lead and, not having control of the game when you think they should. And so a lot of the teams who go on lots of kill shots and conversely don't give them up are often the most successful teams that we see in the season and during the tournament. Duke led the nation in kill shots this year. I think they had 39 of them, and they only gave up 8 in return. Florida was top 5 in that category in terms of number of kill shots that they had during the season, and we certainly saw that during their run to a national title game where, they had to come from behind multiple times in the tournament, and they often had these big extended scoring runs that really always meant that even if they were behind, they always were capable of finally wrestling the game from the opponent. And so, these have been really key to a lot of the success that we've seen. And as I've looked at kind of factors for how this is predictive of team success heading into the tournament, a lot of times it's not the teams necessarily who are the best at going on lots of kill shots who do the best. It's the teams who are really foolproof in not giving many of them up per game who are often the best. And I think that really tracks because oftentimes the teams that win a national title are the teams that are better, stronger, more talented than other teams in the tournament. And so oftentimes they're going to be favorites in a lot of these games. And if you have a talented team who also is very secure with a lead and is not susceptible of crumbling down the stretch and giving it away. These are oftentimes the teams that have the right recipe for success in winning 6 games in a tournament. And that's certainly what we've seen in terms of the data, looking at teams who have had success in March.
Yep, I totally agree with you. I think that is so big to be taking a look at because there's nothing more maddening to myself when I've got a bet on a game. It looks like the team is in full control, and then they pee down their leg because they give up a 15-0 run. I've had it happen too many times the last few years, Evan, and you do a great job of being able to extract that data. You do a great job in general of taking a look at this wonderful game of college basketball, just a wealth of knowledge in general. So, Evan, let the good people at home know what's all on tap for you, what you're going to be working on this season, and how people are able to take a look at your work on social media and other platforms.
So you can find everything at evanmiya.com. There's different levels of subscriptions based on what level of data you want to get into, but there's also a bunch of free stuff too. And there's links to all of my social media platforms there. I'm really active on Twitter, which is where a lot of people find me, but I'm on other platforms as well, like Instagram and TikTok. I also have a blog where I post a lot of really interesting analysis. I've got a piece coming up this week on basically, expanding more on these roster construction strategies that we talked about for high major teams and what the data suggests as the best strategies and methods for building a roster in the modern portal era. So you can subscribe to my blog and check that out. That's going to be up in the next couple of days. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers it.
Absolutely. And Evan, he's doing such an amazing job taking a look at this great game that we all know of college basketball, much like myself, all 12 months out of the year. So a big thanks to Evan for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And coming next, it is that time podcast. I'll give you a recap of the news and notes we saw in college basketball. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by Evan Miyakawa. He does such great work over at evanmiya.com, being able to gauge this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. Every single time he joins me, he lends such great insights. He did so once again today. So a big thanks to Evan for joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And now it is that time in the podcast that I give you a recap of all the news and notes that we saw in college basketball over the last 24 hours. This is pretty much the deadline of being able to enter into the transfer portal, so you saw a lot of new guys enter into the transfer portal, and as a matter of fact, I will hit refresh on verbal commits, and just to let you in behind the curtain, I'm hitting this right around about 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, and we did reach 2,400 guys in the transfer portal. Like, it is just absolutely wild and crazy. Again, you would have an easier time making a list of guys that did not enter into the transfer portal rather than guys that did enter into the transfer portal, but we did see a few guys decide where they are going to be going on Tuesday, and we're not going to go through all the guys that entered in the transfer portal because, again, just too long of a list, but that said, we did see Dallas Hobbs decide that he is going to be going to Rice. We give our Oda Lane Kiffin go Owls, as Rice, they did have a little bit of difficulty with their three-point shooting last year, and Hobbs not going to do a tremendous job of helping out with that. Only shot about 31% from three this past season over at Mount St. Mary's, but guy that is able to be a bucket getter, 12.5 points, 3.5 assists. Guy that did turn the ball over about 2.8 times for contests, and Rice did have their turnover issues. Mount St. Mary's had their turnover issues. So, this is something that it very much is going to be able to fit the Rice style, but I don't know if that's necessarily the world's greatest thing for them. So, they know what they're going to be getting here, and I do like Robert Lanier as a coach. I do think that he's going to get Rice online. Do need to have around him a few more shooters, though, and for Rice, it's going to be very paramount that they take better care of the ball this season. We are going to see if these guys are going to be able to do a rock-solid job this season. As USC, they're bringing in Rodney Rice. Rice was a big part of that Crab 5 last season over at Maryland, and he was able to log for the team 14 points per contest, shot 37% from three-point range, and was a highly touted guy coming out of high school, went over to Virginia Tech, just was marred by injuries in his first 2 years at the collegiate level. Now that he's been rock solid and he has been able to get out there on the floor, he's been able to show his worth, and for USC, it's been a very interesting mix of guys because, as we know with USC, they're going to bring in 100 million billion guys in the transfer portal. It's going to take them a little bit of time during the season to be able to figure it out, and the big thing is you're banking on them being able to figure it out towards the end of the year. But they brought in some solid talent. Jacob Kofi is a 6'9", little bit of a combo player that comes in from Virginia. Gabe Dines was one of the best shot blockers in all of college basketball last season. Keontae Jones, who was over at CSUN, Cal State Northridge, good versatility there. Jaden Brownell over from Sam Amford as well. So I do like some of the pieces that are being brought in. So I do think that there's some upside here with the USC, and then I do think that there's some upside with this one as well. Lazar Djokovic, he was over at Charleston this last season, and he was a well-rounded guy at 6'11", was able to log for the team about 8 points, 6 boards, block per contest. Not a guy that's going to go out on the perimeter and is going to completely light it up from three-point range or anything like that, but he has decided that he is going to be going to VCU. I really like what Phil Martelli Jr. is doing here with VCU. They brought in quite a few ads, as they've got a few guys from Bryant that are going to be following him, and Keyshawn Mitchell along with Barry Evans, so good versatility out of both of those guys. You bring in Djokovic, who stands right around about 6'10". Ahmad Noel is a former top 75 recruit who comes in from UConn after figuring that he's going to see some time at the point. Tyrell Ward 2 seasons ago over at LSU was a 9-point per game scorer, a guy that's able to shoot it relatively well from three-point. So this team has a lot of goods, and for Djokovic, he is someone that I think has the propensity to be able to shoot it a little bit more from three-point. He attempted a few threes at Charleston last year, just was unable to knock them down, but actually began his career over at Xavier, so I really do like this ad for them. It was looking like Sam Walters was going to be going to Mississippi State, which I thought was going to be a really nice skip for them because he was over at Michigan last season, 6'10" combo player that was able to average about 5 points per contest, was a mid-30s three-point shooter, but now he's decided that he is going to be going to SMU. And for SMU, I forget who it was, but I know that they lost a recruit over the last few days, or I should say a guy that they were going to be acquiring via the transfer portal, but for SMU, they're putting together a really nice offseason. Being able to bring in a guy like a Walters who's got good size, good versatility, that's going to be able to help them out right away. But that said, with this SMU team, I do think that they're building something that is going to be long-lasting out in an ACC that, let's call it what it is, the ACC is very much down right now, so they should be able to go out there, have themselves quite a bit of immediate success. I do think that for SMU, it might be a little bit interesting to see what we get the next few months out of this program in general, and I do think that there might be a piece or two that they do need to add moving forward, but being able to get an addition like this, along with bringing in Jerron Pierre, Corey Washington 6'6" combo player from Wichita State, and Pierre, one of the top scorers in all of college basketball last season, they're really starting to fill out a nice, well-rounded roster, and so is Tulane. Tulane is going to need to have more depth than they've had in past seasons, but they have Scotty Middleton, 6'6", a little bit of a combo player who shot 38% from three, coming in from Seton Hall. He was one of the lone guys over at Seton Hall that was able to shoot it from three-point range. And again, I did mention it in passing, but I'll mention it again. Tulane, please, for the love of Pete, you need to have more than 5 guys that see minutes, because that has been rough for them, to say the least, and this is really their first addition in the transfer portal. But if Tulane can add a little bit more depth, that they can find just a guy or two in general that's able to take over the game for the team, add a little bit more down low, I do think that there's some upside with this team, but again, are they going to be able to find that depth? That is really the big question mark that you do have with this team. You have no question marks as to what you're going to be getting here, though. Dylan Anderson, he's going from Boise State, and he's going to be heading on over to Murray State. For Anderson, a true 7-footer, began his career over at Arizona, former top 200 recruit, only saw about 3.5 points per contest, was sort of stuck in the shadow of some of those guys like Tyson Dagenhart and company. For Murray State, I really like this pickup for them, as for Murray State, they were a team that really lacked that true big guys last season. They were able to do a good job of by committee being able to hit the boards, but you can tell that this is a team that's looking to go in a little bit of a different direction ever since they can't see Prom, and they have really hit the transfer portal hard. They bring in Javon Jackson, a nice double-figure scorer over at UIC. The two Creighton guys that just didn't see a ton of minutes, Mason Miller, Frederick King being a 6'10" big man, he's going to be coming in as well. You bring in Lane Taylor, a nice double-figure scorer from Central Arkansas. KJ Tenner is going to be coming on over from West Virginia. You've got weapons upon weapons with this Murray State team. I think that they've done a really nice job of being able to revamp here in the offseason, and they're going to have plenty of depth for this upcoming year as well. You don't necessarily have that one go-to guy, but you do have a lot of guys that will go out there and contribute. And you've got Duke Miles heading on over to Texas A&M. He's going to be playing a little bit of buckyball, and I think that he's going to fit the system really well. A great three-point shooter. He's able to shoot 43% from three, averaging nearly a steal and apple contest over at Oklahoma last year, 9.5 points per game. For Bucky McMillan's system, I think that Duke Miles is actually a really, really good fit, and I'm starting to feel more and more bullish on this Texas A&M team by the day, because with Texas A&M going to be fighting at a little bit of an uphill battle, trying to zag while everyone else zigs out there in the SEC. Really, nobody else plays that style out there, but you bring in Mackenzie Mbakbo, who I think is a good fit for the team. Zach Clemens is going to be able to do a nice job down low for the team. They've already got Josh Holloway, who's coming on over with Bucky McMillan from Sam Amford. You've got Jakari Lane who's coming in as well. This is a relatively nice haul for Texas A&M thus far. They still have a few more pieces to go. I would like to see them be able to get a little bit more versatility in terms of like back in the day, a core, something like that. But overall, I do like what they're building out there. I do like what this team is looking to build as well. Robert Morris, they lose their main big man, Alvaro Falgarius, who he decided that he was going to be transferring a few weeks ago. But you bring in Nicolas Chedakudis, who is over at North Carolina A&T, to hold things down. Doesn't have quite the three-point shooting of Falgarius or anything like that, but he was able to log about 11 points, block and a half, steal per game, a little bit over 9 rebounds per game. Going to do a rock-solid job down low for our Robert Morris team that prior to last year, they just didn't have a ton down low. So I do think that this is a nice pickup for them, and I do think that that's going to be able to very much fit what they're going to be looking to do. I think that Ball State has a nice fit here as well as they bring in Juwan Maxey from Youngstown State. He was a starter last year that averaged 11.5 points, shot about 34% from three-point range. This is a Ball State unit that last season they were a relatively good team around the perimeter, and for Ball State, I do think that there's quite a bit of upside with this program. Like, I liked a lot of the pieces that they had last season. Being able to bring back someone like a Peyton Sparks, I thought was very big for them. Now we shall see what happens with regards to their low post play moving forward. And for Ball State, this is really the first big pickup other than Caden Fish, who comes over from Iowa State. So their work very much not done in terms of transfer portal. But that said, I do think that this is going to be a solid pickup for them. And I do think that there's going to be quite a bit of upside moving forward. And in terms of what we saw in college basketball on Tuesday, it was a lot of guys that just decided that they were going to add their name into the transfer portal. You saw the likes of Boogie Flan and company, so you don't have as many commitments from yesterday. But this one I thought was interesting. Garweed Duel. He was over at Seton Hall, a former top 75 recruit that it just hasn't materialized for him. He was a starter last year over at Seton Hall, but only about 5.5 points per game. He did dole out about 3 assists per game, but I've just expected more out of him in general. But being able to go to McNeese State, it's a nice buy low spot for them. They get a guy that had a whole bunch of upside on him coming out of high school, and I think that McNeese State is doing a really good job of just being able to find some ads in general. Coach Armstrong, who's coming on over from Baylor, I think that he's going to be able to do a nice job with this program and just be able to pick up where, for lack of a better term, Will Wade was able to leave off, as they've got Jarrell Colbert, who's coming on over from SMU. He's going to be rock solid in the post. You've got Larry Johnson, who comes on over from Creighton as well. A lot of these guys that were a little bit more passed over, couldn't quite find their peak potential out there at the Power Conference level. These guys coming in, I think that they are going to be able to do a nice job here. You've got Elijah Jamison, who he 2 seasons ago was rock solid over at UW Milwaukee with about 9 points, 2.5 assists per game. He only played 4 games this last year over at UNC Wilmington due to injury. He has decided that he is going to be going to Norfolk State. For Norfolk State, they had the likes of Brian Taylor and company in that backcourt 8 seasons ago. And Norfolk State always does a pretty solid job of having a nice go-to scorer. I should say Brian Moore was that main scorer for them 8 seasons ago. But that said, him being able to come in, sort of take over that Brian Moore role is something I do like. He should be able to have the ball in his hands quite a bit. I'd be very surprised if the offense is not completely running through him. And for Norfolk State, it's going to be interesting to see what else they're going to be able to add in the transfer portal, as they could use another piece or two, but this is a nice place to be able to start. You've got Deion Wright-Ford, who's also coming in from Texas A&M Corpus Christi. He's able to be a nice lockdown defender, so I really like what they're looking to build in that backcourt. You've got Nate Gurgoma. Hopefully I said that correctly. He was over at UMass this last season as a freshman, wasn't able to get out there on the floor too much. He was only able to see for the team right around about 2.5 points per contest, and let's call it what it is. UMass over the last few seasons under Frank Martin just has not been able to get anything going whatsoever, so I've got a lot of question marks as to how they're trying to operate things, but he's going to be coming in, and just coming out of high school, he was a guy that was more of a 3-star recruit, according to 247 Sports. Being able to get this sort of an ad for Quinnipiac, he only stands right around 6'4", or 6'5", but that said, he's got some very good ability to be able to hit the glass, be able to grab some good rebounds. I think that he offers a lot of upside to this program, and you've always got upside on this podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, because I'm with you guys every single day, taking a look at all these moves that we are getting in college basketball. And if you do like what you're hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of 2 ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters EM, name does not matter, so as per usual, please send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you are able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And a big thanks once again to Evan Miyakawa, who does great work over at evanmia.com. He joined me in the last segment, and I'm coming at at you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. So I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.
If your job at a healthcare facility includes disinfecting against viruses, you know prevention is the best medicine, and maintaining healthy spaces starts with a healthy cleaning routine. Grainger's world-class supply chain helps ensure you have the quality products you need when you need them, from disinfectants and cleaning supplies to personal protective equipment, so you can help deliver a clean bill of health. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.